everybody, welcome back to World History. So we're doing our next section of notes today, continuing our discussion on World War II. So we're going to talk about the Axis advance for today. Now, the Nazis invaded Poland utilizing the system known as Blitzkrieg, or a lightning war, that ultimately was utilizing improved tank and air power tech. And the German Air Force, known as the Luftwaffe, struck first. Now, at the same time, Stalin invaded from the east, and Poland was gone. And Great Britain and France couldn't help due to their distance. They couldn't get to Poland fast enough prior to it falling. This resulted in them declaring war. So eventually, France and Great Britain were behind the Maginot Line, a defensive line built in the 1930s to deter the invasion by Germany and force them to move around the fortifications. This line here, with a whole bunch of bunkers and whatnot to slow them down. However, the Germans surprised the French by attacking through the Ardennes forest, which we do have some proof, and German troops flooded into France. Now, in May of 1940, we have the events at Dunkirk, a port in France from which 300,000 Allied troops were evacuated and were trapped between the Nazis and the English Channel. It raised British morale for the war due to a lot of the ships that were used to evacuate soldiers were of civilian crafts. People that were simply just out sailing for the day began to pick up soldiers and transport them to England. Now, it's important to note, France falls. They signed a surrender and docks in the same railroad car that Germany signed the armistice after World War I, and a new capital was established in Vichy, a capital of the German puppet state in South France. Now, they also completely captured the city of Paris. With this, while there were still French people fighting in the Allied forces, for the most part, the French are really going to take a back seat for the war. They're more so just going to spend most of the war under the occupation of the Nazis. Now, Germany thought Great Britain would eventually fold, and they'd be wrong with that because the British did not give up. And with the defiance of their new Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, they began Operation Sea Lion, an invasion of Great Britain, with massive airstrikes versus military targets and then cities. They utilized the Blitzkrieg on London as well. Great Britain was more determined, and Hitler failed to take Britain because of their resolve. Now, we also have to talk about the situation in Africa as well. Now, General Erwin Rommel, the brilliant Nazi commander, aka Desert Fox, pushed Great Britain out of Libya to Egypt. Italy then invaded Greece, and Germany reinforced them. Now the Axis powers now had complete control over Greece, Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, and Hungary. By 1941, the Axis powers, or the Allies, controlled most of Europe. Meaning most of Europe was out of the hands of the free world. It was under the control of either Germany or Italy. Now, Germany then decided, you know what, we're going to stab the Russians in the back and invade. Now, this was great for Great Britain, and bad, very bad for Germany, under Operation Barbarossa, which goals were to take natural resources for Germany, to swim in the plenty, and to crush communism and beat Stalin. Even though they had signed a non-aggression pact, Hitler was so worried about communism, he decided to stab his ally in the back. Now, Stalin was pretty unprepared for this and lost 2.5 million soldiers. They destroyed factories, farm equipment, and burned crops as they retreated, utilizing that scorched earth policy we talked about during Napoleon's invasion. Now, Germany would eventually be in position to take the cities of Moscow and Leningrad, but then they'd be stalled by the winter. And if any of you were remembering that French Revolution lesson on Napoleon, hint, hint, some similar things about to happen. Now, they had laid siege to the city of Leningrad. For 2.5 years, over 1 million lives would be lost, and they would begin to ration to roughly 2 pieces of bread per day. Stalin reached out to Great Britain for help, and Germany was unsuccessful in this invasion again. Now, life under the Nazis and even Japanese occupation. Hitler's New Order had some pretty strong racial obsessions, and these puppet governments led by the Aryans began to plunder and loot the various places. These territories were looted of basically every major resource, and resistance was met with shootings and tortures. And in the 30s, this was, for the most part, what we saw. We also see the establishment of the concentration camps, or detention centers for civilians considered enemies of the state, or essentially thousands of Jewish people. Now, the Nazis began to commit genocide against the racially inferior. They went against Jews, Slavs, Romas, we know them as gypsies, anybody a part of the LGBTQ plus community, those that were disabled. There are stories of them going into mental asylums and just shooting all the patients. And Jews were then forced into ghettos or confined sections of the city until they determined the final solution, which was genocide, a deliberate killing of a large number of people from a particular nation or ethnic group with the aim of destroying that nation or group. Here are some images from the Holocaust. All the shoes from people that died. Now, the Holocaust was the systematic genocide of about 6 million European Jews by the Nazis, those of religious and ethnic heritage, essentially racism and intolerance. There were 6 main death camps established in Poland: Auschwitz-Birkenau, Belzec, Chełmno, Majdanek, Sobibor, and Treblinka. You would either be gassed, worked to death, or have medical experiments conducted on you. There was one famous Nazi scientist that conducted experimentation on twins. Let's just say the descriptions of that really make me sick to my stomach. Now, partisans and people began to rise up and resist, and immigration policies prevented refuge to those. Jewish people trying to escape Europe even got turned away from the United States before we joined the war. Since we were trying to stay out of the war, we kind of like, no, sorry, you can't stay, you have to go back. Here's some pictures of some resistance groups. Now, Japan at the same time was working on an empire in Asia and the Pacific. Now, their brutal conquest and their mission was to help Asians escape West colonial rule. At least that's the theory. Their actual empire was pretty brutal, actually. Now, eventually, they conquered majority of the Pacific Islands. Their next goal was to attack us. Now, American involvement grew, but the Neutrality Act prevented us from directly declaring war. So we passed the Lend-Lease Act, where we could sell or lend war materials to any country whose defense the president deems vital to the defense of the United States. And we became essentially an arsenal of democracy. So essentially, the only people we were given weapons to was the British and the French, and eventually the Russians. We also signed the Atlantic Charter, now, which called for the final destruction of Nazi tyranny and the right of all to choose their government, and a permanent system of general security as well. But it's important to know, we're not in the war yet. We're not fighting. Now, Japan grabbed all the European territories in Southeast Asia. Things like oil, rubber, tin. These were valuable, especially against their war against China. They also took French Indochina and the Dutch East Indies. And the U.S. banned the sale of war materials, iron, steel, and oil to Japan. And they thought the U.S. was attempting to interfere in their sphere of influence. And we were involved in what you could consider peace talks, but they then reached a standstill. Until General Hideki Tojo, ordered a surprise attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. Sinking multiple battleships and resulting in the deaths of over 1,200 service members and over 500 civilians on that island in Hawaii. They attacked on a Sunday morning before 8 a.m. Most of the soldiers on those ships were still in their racks, sleeping. Here's a picture of Ford Airfield being completely demolished. Now, FDR went on to state in a speech to Congress the next day, yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. They asked Congress to declare war, and we did. 4 days later, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Germany and Italy declare war on the United States as well. Now, it's important to note the Japanese victories and the results of the surprise attack were minor. Yes, they did massively damage the Pacific Fleet, but we were also in a position to rebuild quickly. Plus, our 3 aircraft carriers, by far the most valuable parts of our fleet, were not in Pearl Harbor at the time, thus escaping the attack. Now, the Japanese at the time held the Philippines, the US held islands, Hong Kong, Burma, and Malaya, all places we would free during our time in the Pacific Theater. All right, that's it for notes for today. You don't have a new assignment for today, so I'll see you all next time. Bye, everyone.